Hey everyone, Coach Micah here, and welcome back to another video. Now this one is going to be a longer one because what I'm doing is reviewing the 5 LD resolutions that were chosen for the selection process, and we could potentially end up with 3, maybe 2 of them in the next LD season. And so what I wanted to do is give y'all an informed video about the pitfalls or the benefits of some of these resolutions. I know at this point some of y'all have already made your vote. So what I'm also going to do is show you that if we were to get some of these resolutions, what the conflicts would be and how to get our minds thinking and to start preparing for them if you're that type of person. Of course, as we get closer to the season, I will have resources for each individual resolution that gets chosen, and hopefully over the summer those will be complete. We want to be prepared for the next season. So I've got a little bit of a different setup here. I've got my whiteboard. I'm not sure how much I will use it. Of course, I have my laptop and I have my iPad, and this is going to be a really fun experiment for me because there's a lot that I'm going to edit at this point, and hopefully you're watching the finished thing right now and you're impressed, I guess. But anyways, let's just start and jump right into it. There are 5 LD resolutions that the Stoa board has given us, and most of them deal with the government in some way. We have Resolution 1, in governance, efficiency ought to be prioritized over deliberation. We have Resolution 2, the power of clemency is essential to a just governance system. Resolution 3, preserving the character of a community justifies limiting individual behavior. Resolution option number 4, in regulating emerging technologies, governments ought to prioritize caution over innovation. And number 5, liberty ought to be prioritized over order. So we've got liberty, regulations, preservation of a community, clemency in a just government system, and in governance. So to some extent, all 5 have to deal with the government. Now, I'm just going to say right off the bat, I don't particularly like government resolutions for Stoa LD, as y'all may have noticed when it comes to our own takes as a league on the government and certain families' takes and their individual takes on the government. Praising the government is a very hard thing to do persuasively, and depending on the context, bashing the government is almost preaching to the choir. So with a bunch of resolutions that deal with government to some extent, I'm a little nervous about the amount of bias that would be in decisions and the lack of persuasion that a lot of students are just going to have. Like, I want to make sure that y'all know that you can reach out to me if you want help with persuasion, but I do think that that is going to be an issue to some extent, especially for community judges. But with all that being said, let's just dive into each of these. I'm going to give my full thoughts. That's why this video is a little bit longer. And then at the end, I will show you the best ones to use or to vote for if you haven't voted already. The timestamp will be in the description below. That way you can skip to wherever you need to go. But without further ado, let's just get straight into it. Access to this document will be in the description of the video. I want you guys to be able to read it if you'd like, and I wasn't really concerned with making it look perfect. I just wanted information down on paper. So that's what this is for. In governance, efficiency ought to be prioritized over deliberation is the resolution that we're given. Now, what I like to do is I just like to, close my eyes and take the first thoughts of this resolution. Efficiency ought to be prioritized over deliberation. What does this resolution mean? Well, efficiency refers to the idea of something being done in a quick manner, but in a quick manner with a positive connotation, right? A manner that is both beneficial and quick, efficient. And that needs to be prioritized over deliberation, which is the idea of discussing something. And ultimately, this gets us into a point of conflict when there's a problem that arises and we actually have to choose between the two. Because remember, in priority resolutions, one does not have to be mutually exclusive. They can both exist, right? So when there is a time to make a choice between being efficient and talking about something for an extended period of time, I'm imagining this is when problems arise. That's the context of this resolution. So within a government setting, a governance setting, I'll show why that's important later. It is important to have speed over talking, over caution. And that's ultimately what the resolution boils down to. Speed versus caution, right? I imagine a lot of debaters are going to focus on the idea of the United States government, although technically the term governance refers to any governing body, and that can be within a corporation or an organization, because large collections of people have some sort of top authority, and the authority that makes decisions that impact the bottom, that is governance, that is governing. So this does not have to be an entirely political resolution, which I really enjoy, because that makes it broad. And having a broad resolution with a lot of unique ways to go allows for a debate that will last a while, especially if we are going to have only 2 resolutions if we decide to vote out the 3rd resolution. So we want a resolution that has good longevity, meaning it's going to last a while and not get stale. Let's look at what the Stoa board had to say about this one, though. They said this resolution places students in the heart of a foundational tension in political philosophy. I'm going to stop right there. Technically, the wording of the resolution does not mean that we should only talk about politics. Because remember, governance does not necessarily refer to a government. It's just the idea of governing over something. And there are different types of authority that can govern over. So, yes, the Stoa board created the resolution, but the wording that they chose does not equal what they're saying to a certain extent. So the trade-off between speed and process and how governments make decisions. Again, not only governments. But let's look at what the affirmative might argue, right? I have it up here. The affirmative is going to argue that the conflict, right? When there is a problem, the whole point of a government is to solve the problem, and they need to solve that problem relatively quickly, because if they don't, then something bad is going to happen, right? Whereas the negative is going to say, yes, that is true. When there's a conflict, we do want to solve the problem, but if we solve it in the wrong way, then we're going to get harmed, right? We're going to do something that has us, that makes us reverse and fix and things like that. And this is almost really close to the incrementalism and radicalism argument, right? Radicalism sees a problem and just steps in and just goes for it. Whereas incrementalism sees a problem and wants to make sure it takes each necessary step so that nothing bad could happen, right? That's ultimately what this resolution is, but it's switched. The affirmative is going to argue for just let's forego the bureaucracy, let's forego the process and just get stuff done. We just got to get stuff done. Well, the negative is going to argue what happens when we do things quickly, bad things, right? When the government decides to just go full force into something without deliberation, maybe deliberation is hearing people's votes, for example. When we do that, we ultimately create cause for concern because governments aren't that great. They mess up a lot. So we want to make sure that governments don't mess up, and the way they don't mess up is by having as many ideas and devil's advocates as possible, which ultimately leads to a more cautious go. As you can see, there are different words that are really important, right? So again, in governance, how the affirmative defines that word is going to determine the round. And of course, as the negative, you want to make sure that you have a reasonable take, and you can disagree with the arguments that the affirmative makes. Remember, framework wins. You learned that in my last video. The next word, of course, is going to be efficiency. What exactly is efficiency? What does that mean? The word prioritized. What does it mean to prioritize something? LDers should know by now, if you've been debating for a while, that priority can exist in different forms. And you need to make sure that you have a resolutional analysis point that defines what priority means. What is the conflict that arises, and how do we choose one or the other? How do we prioritize one over the other? What does that look like? And then you have deliberation. So governance, efficiency, prioritized, and deliberation are going to be the big words in this debate. And so ultimately, I think this is a really good resolution, specifically because of how broad it is and the fact that it doesn't have to only deal with governments. I think that's really important because we want to make sure that the resolutions are not stale, that they're not stagnant. And yeah, you'll see here, this is a comparison resolution, right? So you'll have to make sure that you show the good logical syllogism. This is also a general burden. It's not mutually exclusive. And priority will need to be specified. Those are my notes. I'm going to give this resolution a 4 out of 5. I really like it. If they wanted to make it only with governments, they would have chosen their words differently. Four out of 5. I like this resolution. I think it would be really fun to debate. I think there's a lot of arguments that can be made. I don't think either side has to necessarily defend the government, but at the same time, either side has an opportunity to be cautious of the government, to be able to critique the government. And I think that's really important for Stoa LD because we love critiquing big government. So with that, let's get into the second resolution. The power of clemency is essential to a just governance system. Not sure why Stoa really likes the word governance, but clemency is a political term, so the governance here is not broadened to different types of governing authorities, but specifically within the government. So again, not sure why they like the word governance, but the power of clemency is essential to a just governance system. So clemency obviously refers to pardons, communications, reprieves, and anytime a president, governor, prime minister, any high authority deals with or looks at someone who has committed a crime and deals with their sentence, either completely removing their sentence or tweaking it in some certain way. The goal of clemency is to make sure that there are no unjust sentences or to show mercy. Now, the power of clemency is essential to a just governance system. This is not a comparison resolution. This is what's called a bright line resolution because we're not comparing two things. We're ultimately trying to prove the condition of one thing, and that's clemency. So we're trying to prove the goodness of clemency. We're going to try to show that the key word here is essential. How do we show that the power of clemency is essential? What does essential mean? The word essential connotes a significant need, almost like a requirement. Without this one thing, the system wouldn't be just. So without clemency, a governance system would not be just. That is what this resolution is saying. And when we dive deep into what the term of clemency is, it is a safeguard against an abuse of power, right? Because when it comes to the judge, for example, any person who has the ability to sentence someone for something may act out of line. And so the power of clemency is there specifically to ensure that doesn't happen. Does clemency always work like that? No. But remember, we're talking about an essential part of a system. Not every single part will be perfect, but it does one specific thing that without it, we would have an unjust system, right? I ultimately think that this resolution is not very good because of course, clemency is essential to a just government system. Now, of course, I say of course. I'm sure the negative would create a good argument against that. But if a think about it like this, close our eyes and think about it like this. If clemency is a safeguard against an abuse of power, then if we were to take out that safeguard, wouldn't it follow that we would have more abuses of power and people get away with it? So in order to prevent an abuse of power on some level, then we need that safeguard. Because a just, this again, what constitutes a just government system? Are there certain things that are included? Let's take a look at the resolution analysis brought up by the Stoa board. This resolution asks students to evaluate whether a just system requires the capacity to correct its own errors, show mercy beyond what the law allows, or respond to circumstances that rigid sentencing cannot anticipate. Affirmative teams will argue that clemency humanizes justice and serves as a necessary check on the imperfections of legal systems. Negative teams will challenge whether clemency undermines the rule of law, introduces arbitrariness, or creates opportunities for abuse of power. Students will engage the philosophy of punishment, political theory, and real historical contemporary examples. Okay. So the affirmative is going to argue that the justice system needs safeguards in order to be just. It needs to be able to correct. Correction is part of justice, right? If someone does something wrong, you correct it. You correct it either through, punishment or rehabilitation, right? We've debated things like that before. Correction is an essential part of justice. So therefore, clemency would be an essential to a just governance system. While the negative would argue, and I see where they're coming from here, the negative would argue more so that a governing authority can just pardon a bunch of people, and by pardoning a bunch of bad people, therefore you have created an abuse of power and justice was not served, then it would be harmful to justice. And I ultimately think that this resolution is going to come down to a lot of examples like that where, for example, President Trump pardons like Kodak Black or some rapper or something like that, and how that was bad because that guy was bad. And I don't know the circumstances on that. I don't know. I feel like this resolution is very narrow. It's very narrow. And yeah, we're going to talk about like the philosophy of punishment and political theory. But because of the word essential, it's going to be the same arguments every time. Justice, and Stoa put it great as well. They basically define it themselves. Justice is a necessary check, or clemency serves as a necessary check on the imperfections of legal systems. I mean, that's pretty persuasive right there because legal systems are imperfect. And, you could probably argue, there's probably evidence out there to show that most of the time, clemency exists specifically to make sure that there isn't unusual crime and punishment. And that's another thing too. The Eighth Amendment plays into this. Constitutionally, no person should have to undergo an unusual crime and punishment. And who's the one person that can enforce that? The government, right? Or the prime minister, the highest part of government. So if there's an Eighth Amendment abuse, then the president is there to make sure that the Eighth Amendment is upheld. So, and that's what they do through clemency. So does that mean the Eighth Amendment cannot be upheld if there's no clemency? I'm not sure. That would be something to look into, right? And ultimately, I just think that there are more arguments to support the affirmative side than the negative side. The affirmative can definitely play into how bad the government is on certain levels, or how bad the justice system is anytime there's some sort of authority, and to show that we need safeguards. Safeguards are really important when we're dealing with the government, so therefore it is essential. It is required. If we were to take out clemency, then the justice system would look completely different, and that would be a bad thing. So I think the affirmative is going to have an easier time with this resolution. And when there is a much easier side, it makes the debate, it doesn't make the debate fun, right? It makes the debate uninteresting to some degree. My final thoughts, right? This is a bright line resolution. You're not comparing two things. This means that the logical syllogism is different. The emphasis lies more on the proof and the evidence. The AF burden is also absolute. That's another thing too. They have to prove that if a government system doesn't have clemency, it doesn't earn the title of just. So if the opponent can show, and this is where I guess you could get into the interesting section for the negative, they can prove that there are other government systems out there that don't have clemency but are just. And of course, the rebuttal to that argument is the idea that, well, other cultures are different from the United States, for example. But this is an absolute burden for affirmative. They have to show that in every single example, if you want a just governance system, you have to have the power of clemency. So you have an absolute burden for the affirmative. They have to prove in all examples you need clemency. But at the same time, a clemency is a safeguard against injustice. That's what it was designed to be. So can a safeguard against injustice, is that required for something to be a just system? Logically, it just follows. If there's going to be injustice, we want to prevent injustice from happening. So in order to have a just system, we need to prevent injustice. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. And so ultimately, it's that line of oversimplified argument. If the resolution is based on a really, really simplified argument that just happens to be true logically, it makes the other side harder to argue, even if the affirmative has an absolute. So I'm not a fan of this resolution. If we had to deal with this one, it's fine. You can find arguments for anything. I'm going to give this one a 2 out of 5. I don't really like it that much. Out of 5. It's too specific, it's too narrow. It is a unique, I really like the type of resolution that it is. I love the idea of a bright line resolution that is absolute. And another example, right? So preemptive warfare is morally justified. That's the opposite of an absolute burden. That was a bright line resolution in which the affirmative just had to prove one example of where it was morally justified. Because if something is morally justified in one example, like 100%, then that means it can be morally justified overall. So this is the flip of that, absolute burden. You cannot have a just system without this thing. So anyways, 2 out of 5, not my favorite. Let's get on to the third resolution. Preserving the character of a community justifies limiting individual behavior. Now, as you can see, that's a lot of words. Not only is it a lot of words, but each word has a meaning that is really important. So you want to talk about a definitions debate. This is a lot of definitions. So, for example, what does it mean to preserve something, right? What do we mean by the character of a community? And we can even break that down. What is character and what is a community? So we have to define community, and then we have to define what a community's character is, right? What does it mean to justify something? What does it mean to limit something? What does that look like? And individual behavior, pretty self-explanatory or not. What is behavior, right? So there's a lot of places for nuance. And not only that, this is a specific burden. So preemptive warfare is morally justified as a specific burden. This is also a specific burden. So the affirmative just has to prove and define the resolution in one way. If there is any example out there which the character of a community is preserved because we limited some type of individual behavior, and by limited, that could be any degree. And maybe the negative shows you have to have significance, but if the affirmative can show that there is one example out there where we have somehow limited individual behavior and it has preserved its character, then therefore it is justified. That is a really big burden off of the affirmative because the negative has an absolute burden. And this is something I forgot to discuss in the previous resolution. If the affirmative has a specific burden, meaning they only have to show one example to be true, then that means the negative has to prove that it can never be true. This is not a general burden resolution. It's not. Justification only needs one example. If something happened once and it was good, then therefore that thing is overall justified because it can be justified. So the negative has to show that there is not one example where limiting individual behavior is ever justified. And that's ultimately the problem, although this resolution is very interesting. That's ultimately the problem that I have with this resolution, because it is a really crazy burden on the negative, because there are so many nuances within this resolution. So many of them. Preservation, right? What does it mean to preserve something? What is the level of preservation? How much of something needs to remain, even if some of it was lost, in order to be considered preserved? Like, let's say, for example, you had a statue, and then that statue lost like a little ear or a nose here and there. Is it still preserved because the majority of the statue is there? What does it mean? What do we mean by the character of a community, right? Is it the shared belief that brings people together? So, for example, you have a group of people with similar belief systems, and they come together, they create some form of community, and they created that community based off of their shared belief. Is that what we mean by character of a community? Because if that is true, then absolutely we should limit individual behavior to some extent, because otherwise we're not going to have a community. If people can just act however they want, then that brings chaos. A great example is Stoa, right? Let's say the Stoa community. The Stoa community does limit individual behavior. It does not allow certain behaviors from individuals. And that's ultimately where this resolution is just a breeze for the affirmative. Now, I like the idea of this resolution, but the problem is the negative will have just such a hard time. Same with the option 2, right? The resolutions are starting to sound very much like just a common sense statement. Yeah, so the individual versus community, because of the way that this resolution is worded and the burden that it gives, it is so hard for the negative side to have a foot in this race. Because limiting is not, although the negative would have to argue as significant, based on just the definitions of the words, limiting can be very insignificant, but it's still an example of limiting. And you don't have a community if everyone can just act however they want. And so while I like the idea of this resolution, again, in execution, I don't think it's worded in a way that is going to be, it's not going to create a debate that will last very long. I think it'll get very stale very quickly. Or the negative will have to come up with some really creative things. And then again, I don't see an example of where that, like, I see so many examples of where this resolution is true. And I'm sure you do as well. Limiting individual behavior is important. Yeah, if you can see an example of where this resolution is true, then this resolution is true because of the burden. This is not a general burden. And that's the problem. A lot of judges are going to have to forego their bias to vote negative. And unfortunately, I don't see that happening a lot in Stoa at the moment. Unfortunately, I think that there aren't that many, and this could be just in a response to the amount of ideas there are out in the world, and how dangerous some of those ideas really are, and just how lax society has become in allowing dangerous ideas. Maybe we've just, doubled down on the truth, which is good, but at the same time, there is a lack of praise for creative ideas and thinking in debate rounds, which is why I don't think this resolution is very good. It's a great subject, love the subject, but I don't like it in terms of just a fair debate, I guess. Like, it doesn't really lead to a good debate. Let's see what the Stoa board has to say, though. Few questions in political philosophy are more enduring than the tension between the individual and community, and this resolution brings that tension to sharp focus. Sharp is an understatement. Affirmative debaters will argue that communities have a legitimate interest in maintaining shared values, traditions, and ways of life, and that some limits on individual behaviors are a reasonable cost of belonging to a community. Negative debaters will contend that such justifications are historically prone to abuse. Okay, let's go to that idea. Prone to abuse. Limiting does not have to be significant in this resolution for it to be true. There are different levels of limitations. All we have to do is show that limits are not going to lead to abuse, which I think is easy to do. So that way, therefore, according to the Stoa board, negative debaters will contend that such justifications are historically prone to abuse, often targeting minority viewpoints or behaviors, and that individual liberty should not yield to majoritarian preferences about community identity. Yes, that is true, but the problem is that's not how the resolution is worded. There are absolutely limitations that should be placed on individual behavior. That's common sense, right? The sin nature of man, people behave in really bad ways. So to an extent, they should be limited. You don't have a community if people come in and do whatever they want. That's never worked for any successful long-term community ever. There are always roles. Roles inherently limit human behavior because you can't go outside of your role. So yes, negative debaters can contend that these are historically prone to abuse, but that's just not realistic in terms of the wording of this resolution, because limiting does not have to be significant. So again, great subject. Unfortunately, an extremely easy affirmative win here. Now, the interest of this debate will come from the inexperience that Stoa debaters may have and the inability to understand what this resolution means for them. Like, they won't take the advantage that's given to them as the affirmative side. But if you have a good debater or a debater who watches my videos, this resolution just doesn't work. It helps the affirmative too much. It's not going to lead to a productive debate for very long. It's not going to last. And as the people from Shark Tank would say, for that reason, I'm out. I'm going to give this one a 2 out of 5 again. 2 out of 5. It's just too hard to negate. Now, again, if we are given this resolution to use, I will 100% have examples, statistics, everything for you guys in a resolutional analysis document to show how the negatives can win. Because debates are not truly 100% or 0%. There's always some nuance. And of course, you can persuade the judge to believe anything, depending on how you say it. All right, let's get into the fourth resolution. And remember, this document that I am referencing will be available in the description below. You can click the link. You guys can read it. Yeah, let's get straight into the fourth one. In regulating emerging technologies, governments ought to prioritize caution over innovation. The speed versus caution idea is reversed for this resolution, although it's not necessarily speed versus caution. It's innovation over caution. And as you may notice, the resolution has a lot of words. So here's our context. In regulating, and because we're talking about governments, when a government puts a regulation on something, within the process of regulation, that is the context. What a government does to regulate things. That's the context. Then we have the phrase emerging technologies, which together mean something and different, they mean something as well. What does it mean for something to emerge? Is it something that is in the process of being developed? Is it something that has been developed and is now the day one put on the market? That's what you'll have to figure out. Technologies, what do we mean by technology? Does it specifically have to deal with computers? Can it deal with other things? Governments, we all know what that is. And ought, anytime we see the word ought, I think in the old days, ought was a big contention in terms of the debaters trying to figure out whether or not something has a moral responsibility. That is not as prevalent anymore, but just to be aware, the word ought. Then we have prioritize, Again, we should all know what that means and the amount of nuance that is involved within that word. Caution over innovation. Okay, what is caution within the setting of regulation? What does that look like? And innovation, what does that look like in terms of regulations? This one is a more interesting debate, and there's enough nuance to be just like the first one. How I gave the first one a 4 out of 5, I would also give this one a 4 out of 5. I really like this in terms of the ability of the affirmative or the negative to show the goodness or badness of either side. I think there is an equal burden here. It is a general burden, so it's really easy to prove equality. And because of that, this is going to be a fun resolution if chosen, because there's a lot of different examples of emerging tech. So for example, Stoa says, as artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and other emerging fields reshape society at an unprecedented pace, this resolution asks students to wrestle with one of the most pressing government questions of our time. Again, governance in there, that's funny. Affirmative teams will make the case that potential harms of unregulated technological development, ranging from safety risks to ethical violations to systematic disruption, justify a cautious regulatory response. Negative teams will argue that excessive caution stifles progress, entrenches existing power structures, and often causes its own harms by delaying beneficial technology. Yeah, I mean, that pretty much hit the nail on the head. Tech is really important. And if we regulate it too much, then we are going to be stagnant as a society. But if we don't regulate it at all, then we could harm it. So this is where we have to find the right balance. And so that's what the debaters are going to have to do. They're going to have to find the right balance. And that could make for a really interesting debate, especially because of the amount of technology out there and hindsight that we have. Within the Industrial Revolution, we can look back at different examples, and because history repeats itself over time, and show with human nature what happens when we allow for something to be allowed, basically, right? When we allow something to happen. Yeah, context is a specific expression of the first resolution, efficiency versus deliberation, caution over innovation. As new technologies are developed, governments need to ensure that tech is safe, even if that means preventing certain tests or discouraging inventors from moving forward with their ideas. That's ultimately what the thesis is. If we were to make the resolution, those commercials, if coffee was honest, that's what this is. If the resolution was honest, that's how it would be expressed. There's so many different terms here: regulation, emerging technologies, governments, ought, prioritize, caution, innovation. A lot of different definitions. And that's another thing too with some of these resolutions. They're very long. Definitions are going to be really fun. And when the affirmative or negative does not define a term, then that could lead to a misunderstanding or debates that are hard to win because you're assuming the judge knows something that they don't know. So I'm going to say it right now. Make sure that you define your terms. Now, I do think that there is a little bit of government bias in this resolution because obviously we want to make sure that governments don't overstep their bounds. And we would argue that there's a lot of bad restrictions right now anyways, whether it be taxes or other things that add to the restrictions and regulations and that it harms. There's a lot of places in society that need to get better, but just aren't because of bureaucracy and stuff like that. So I think there is a little bit of government bias here. I do think that initially the affirmative will prove the resolution true. And the reason I say that is they'll have an easier time, by proving the resolution true. There are a lot of technologies that don't exist at the moment. Why? There's a lot of creative people out there. If you've watched any YouTube videos, you know there are people creating all sorts of stuff. Why do we have the same amount of tech, I guess? And because can technology include any sort of medicine or medicinal thing? There are so many things that people try to create that aren't allowed on the market because of how dangerous they are. And I think if the affirmative can show that, then it would be really easy to prove that the resolution is true. So I do think that there is enough nuance, and even though there is a little bit of bias here and there, it would still lead to a good debate. Initially, I said that affirmative will have an easier time proving the resolution true. The negative will need to be creative to win. I think this isn't general enough to be an interesting debate for very long. I'm going to rescind that as I look more at this resolution and as I've thought about it more. I think this could actually be a really good debate. I do think that it leans towards affirmative because obviously we can't just have total chaos in terms of what people are putting on the market. But I do think that there can be arguments for both. So for that reason, I'm going to give this resolution a 4 out of 5. I like it. I think it's interesting, and I think it helps us. And so at the end of the day, that means that resolutions 1 and 4 are the best ones, in my opinion, for a long debate. In terms of interest, in terms of fairness, in terms of an enjoyable debate, these are the ones that are going to shine through. With that, let's get into analyzing the 5th resolution. Liberty ought to be prioritized over order. Yeah, I'm sure you're all thinking what I'm thinking. And if not, have y'all ever heard the phrase, give me liberty or give me death? That political philosophy is actually something I feel like a lot of Stoics probably hold. And that's because liberty, not synonymous with freedom, is a really important idea that allows for humans to be dignified. And resolutions give us a conflict. Whenever we talk about prioritizing something over something else, you have to choose it over something else. And that conflict is necessary for any resolution to be true or false. You can't have both at the same time. That would be balance, right? Has there ever been a time where we should choose order over liberty? Because should we ever sacrifice liberty to have order? No, I don't think that's ever happened. I don't think anyone would agree with that argument, at least not in this community, right? And although the community one was a little more broad, preserving the character of a community justifies limiting individual behavior, this one takes that to a higher extreme. Specifically, liberty ought to be prioritized over order. And yeah, I think this is a terrible resolution, if I'm being completely honest, because the community that we're debating in would affirm this resolution 9 times out of 10. And that is problematic for an interesting debate. And even what the Stoa explanation says, they get into a type of argument that I've talked about in the previous video when we looked at the affirmative as too weak. The foundation versus the building argument is not good, in my opinion. So they say negative debaters will argue that order is the foundation upon which liberty itself depends, and that some constraints on freedom are necessary for any free society to function. Here's the problem with that argument. One, just because you build the foundation of something does not mean that thing is more important than the thing built upon it, right? Let's say that we laid a concrete slab on a plot of land that served the foundation for a church. Is the church building where people can meet and gather and learn about the Lord less important than the concrete slab below it? Because we wouldn't have a church without the concrete slab? That doesn't make sense, right? Foundational arguments are not persuasive. Now, of course, debaters are winning with it because not everyone thinks like a coach, or not everyone knows how to debate or beat that argument. So the Stoa board is saying, well, the negatives will have to argue that order is the foundation. Order being the foundation doesn't mean anything, because if anything, that just says these two things are valuable for different reasons. One is valuable because it's the foundation. One is valuable because it's the execution. They're both valuable. You can't say that the foundation is more important than the execution. That doesn't make sense. So the only other argument that they give here is that some constraints and freedom are necessary for any free society to function. 100%. That's why liberty and freedom are not synonymous. Liberty is a particular type of freedom, one that is restricted to a certain extent. Let's go into the definitions here. Liberty definition. The state of being free from oppressive restrictions, arbitrary government control, or physical confinement, encompassing both personal autonomy and civil rights, according to Google. Let's look at that one more time. Liberty is the state of being free from oppressive restrictions. What happens when we restrict a majority of liberty? We get oppressive restrictions. So basically, what this resolution is saying, if you really want to get down into it, liberty ought to be prioritized over oppressive restrictions. Or, resolved, there should be no oppressive restrictions on people. That's ultimately what the resolution is saying. It's way too specific. And this makes me like the resolution 3, preserving the character of a community justifies limiting individual behavior more, even though I think that resolution isn't great. That resolution happens to be, it's just better than this one because it's a little more broad. It allows for a little more nuance. This doesn't allow for very much nuance. So I guess I see where the Stoa board is trying to go with this resolution, but it doesn't work for an interesting debate. The bias here is very strong for the affirmative. If the only negative argument is that we have to have a foundation and that's what order is, if that's their only argument, that argument will be beaten so many times. And another thing too, negative might try to go with a balance. Well, we have to have liberty and order. True. But if we had to choose between one, which is the conflict, right? They're both equally valuable, sure. But let's say we did have to choose, because in the real world, we do have to choose one or the other. And if governments are never 100% balanced, so they need to choose. Which one do we choose? Which one would you choose? Liberty or order? And again, this is not mutually exclusive, right? So obviously, we're not going to have societal collapse if we prioritize liberty, because therefore everybody will be able to act however they want. It's not freedom over order. Liberty is just the freedom from an oppressive restriction. There can be restrictions, they just can't be oppressive. So already, liberty in itself is restricted to an extent. So if we were to prioritize order over liberty, we would be adding more restrictions in order to uphold order. We're already liberty is already restricted but not over-restricted, so putting order would make it over-restricted, which would violate liberty, which give me liberty or give me death, right? So for that reason, this resolution, unfortunately ratings can't go 0, so I'm gonna give it a 1 out of 5. One out of 5. Not great. Probably the worst one of all of these. And that leads us to the question, what are the 3 resolutions that we should vote for? The obvious answers are 1, in governance, efficiency ought to be prioritized over deliberation. Those words are really nuanced and can create a really creative debate. Number 4, in regulating emerging technologies, governments ought to prioritize caution over innovation. But what about number 3? Our options are 2 and 3, because 5 is not an option for any productive debate. Clemency or preservation of the character of a community? I'm going to let you all decide. I personally think that the power of clemency will be just a tad bit more nuanced and create an interesting debate, just like by a really small margin. But we could absolutely argue option number 3, preserving the character of a community justifies limiting individual behavior. Not 5. Please not 5. Don't vote for number 5, please. So our selections, our options: efficiency over deliberation, caution over innovation, and it's up to you. Clemency or community. I hope this video was helpful. It's really fun to look at the resolutions and get ready for them. And the cool thing about the first two is that the arguments are kind of switched. And so what this will ultimately allow the debaters to do is take some of the same principles from their arguments and reverse them for the next round or for the next debate part of the season, which would be really, really cool. And ultimately for LDers would be really nice, because that means all the preparation they're doing for one resolution are relevant for the second, which is hard to say sometimes. And if we go to a 2-resolution vote, those 2 for sure are the best out of the rest of them. So anyways, I hope this video was helpful. It was fun to experiment with different media and focus on how I can make these videos helpful and entertaining, of course. Once again, make sure that you understand the resolution and think about the long-term effects of it, what you would have to judge or how you would have to compete in order to uphold or negate the resolution before you make a vote. Because if you don't understand what the resolution is, or you go on it just on a whim, and I actually didn't like any of these resolutions to start. Maybe it's because I didn't like the topics, but once I've thought about them over the course of a day or two, I was like, you know what? Actually, they're pretty good. They're pretty educational. So make sure you fully understand the resolutions before you vote for them, because LD should be fun, in my opinion. It should be instructive, it should be educational, but it should also be fun. And some of these resolutions are not going to be fun to debate. Anyways, I will see you guys in the next one. Let me know in the comments what you thought about the format of this video. And to those of you who are getting ready for Night Talk, I am open for any coaching. If you want to practice debate round, if you want any ideas on how to make your argument stronger, if you don't know how to read the ballots or how to interpret the feedback that you got from judges at your recent tournament, maybe you just got 2 check marks and you want to know how to compete at Night Talk because you've never done it before, I would love to be able to help you out. CoachMikeIdeas@gmail.com is the place to reach me. And I want to be as helpful as a resource as possible. With that being said, I hope you guys have a great day. I will see you in the next video.